and welcome to the very first episode of Drive Home Reviews Meet Abbott and Costello. So, to start us off, we're going to take a look at the boys' big screen debut, and that is 1940's One Night in the Tropics. Now, I think it's important to state, before we get going here, that One Night in the Tropics is not an Abbott and Costello movie. One Night in the Tropics is a movie that has Abbott and Costello in it. You got to understand a couple things about how comedies were done and how certain comedies were put together back in the early 40s, going into the war years. If you weren't one of the big comedy acts, and this movie clearly was not one of the big ones. It had some star power behind it, but this is not there's no big stars in this, really. This isn't a Hope and Crosby film. This isn't a Marx Brothers film. It's just kind of one of the standard comedies the studio would release each year. But comedies back then were structured very differently because they were coming off of vaudeville and, by extension, coming off of early Broadway. Early Broadway musicals were not kind of what we consider them today. They weren't the Fiddler on the Roofs. They weren't the Cabarets. They weren't the Hamiltons. They weren't even the Cats. It was a very different structure to musicals back in the day. The stories were fairly simplistic, usually romantic stories, the early versions of romantic comedies. Very standard boy meets girl, boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl kind of things. Usually Cinderella stories. They would feature a young girl who really wanted to make it big and, then does. But just a very thin plot, something to just kind of link the story together. But as the story would go along, you'd have these kind of interludes or breaks where other acts would happen. See, musicals back then, the songs weren't there to help tell the story. They were there to help sell the sheet music to the song. That was how you got your song heard back then, was having it in a Broadway variety show. So halfway through a lot of these shows, there would just be a song, just a random song. And then there would be a dance number, and then there would be a comedian. And then the story would pick back up again. And then they'd break and do another song, and another dance, another comedian, and so on, and so on, and so on. Even Bud and Lou's radio show kind of had this formula. They do the first act, and then they'd have a song, then they do the second act, song, and then the third act. So, this movie is very much in that vein. It's very much in that vaudeville vein. It has a very thin, romantic plot about, I don't even quite know what the plot's about. We'll talk about kind of that problem here in a second. But the plot basically is about this guy, played by Robert Cummings, who is going to get married to his gal, played by Nancy Kelly. And her aunt doesn't want her to marry him, and he keeps messing it up, and his old girlfriend, played by Peggy Morin, comes and makes it difficult. And his buddy, who is the actual lead of the movie, played by Alan Jones, basically sells him a love insurance policy that if he doesn't get married, he's going to get $1 million, or if he does get married, he's going to get $1 million. It's very confusing. But it's a very confusing little love story farce, basically. And broken up in this story, you have musical numbers. Musical numbers written by Jerome Kern, which is kind of bizarre. If you don't know, Jerome Kern was a very popular composer at the time and a very influential part of Broadway history. He was he was the composer on Showboat. Worked with Oscar Hammerstein. So Jerome Kern is a fairly important guy in entertainment history, and he wrote the songs for this. So you'd have these song breaks, and sometimes a dance break, and you had a comedic break. So you had a comedic break in a comedy. So the original comedy was not good enough. You had to have comic breaks within this movie, and those fell to Abbott and Costello. At this time, Abbott and Costello were very popular on the radio, and this was kind of their big coming out party. This was their big screen debut. Audiences had heard them, and they had a very successful radio show, but they hadn't really seen them unless you'd seen them on stage. So Bud and Lou are brought in basically to interject some vaudeville-style comedy. They come in, they do one of their routines, and then they kind of bugger off. They have a part and they have a role in the movie, but it's so disjointed from the rest of the film that it really does feel like, and we cut away to Bud and Lou. And now we're back to the story. But Bud and Lou play henchmen of a gangster played by William Frawley, who, you know, classic film and television buffs will know as Fred Mertz from I Love Lucy. But he's a gangster who is somehow involved with this. And again, I can't tell if he's supposed to get $1 million or lose $1 million if the guy gets married. It's very difficult to tell. But he basically makes Bud and Lou follow the leads around for some reason. And that gives a reason for Bud and Lou to kind of be there, do their routine, and scarper off when the plot doesn't need them anymore. As you can imagine from my description here, putting it simply, guys, this movie is terrible. This is a really bad movie. It is painful to get through. It's an hour and a half, and yet it drags. The plot makes absolutely no fucking sense. Like I said, I can't tell you who's supposed to get what, or who's doing, you know, why anyone is doing what they're doing. Basically, the premise is you have two guys and two girls. They pair off, but each guy wants to be with the other girl, and the other girl wants to be with the other guy. It's, you know, it's a Midsummer Night's Dream, but stupid. So yeah, it's a bad, boring, just tedious film to get through. And the only saving grace of it is the presence of Abbott and Costello. And even then, their stuff is not given enough time to breathe. They do basically 5 or 6 little interludes with Bud and Lou, where they do one of their classic routines, one of their vaudeville routines. They do 2 tens for a 5, which is one of their classic bits. They do Lou trying to tell the story, but Bud keeps interrupting him. They do that. They're going to do that in another one of their movies later on. They even do a butchered version of Who's On First, which is just, it's bad. And it's not bad because of them. It's bad because it's hacked to the bone, and it is not treated with kind of the aura that it deserves. And even back then, you gotta understand, even back then, Who's On First was a fucking masterpiece of comedy. Bud and Lou made their career on Who's On First. There's a reason why it's their signature piece. So radio listeners had heard this. They knew that it was their piece, and yet it's like just hacked to the bone here. Their stuff early on is not given any chance to breathe, and that's part of the brilliance of Abbott and Costello timing, is they know when to go fast and when to do the quick line picks up, but they also know when to stop, take a breath, react, and then get back into it, giving the audience time to laugh and recover and then set up for the next joke. And early on, this film doesn't do that. They're rushed, and they just feel tacked on. Later, towards the latter half of the film, 2 of their bits do get some time to breathe, and they're really good. The story bit, where Lou is trying to tell the story and Bud interrupts him, is okay, but they're going to do that better in Here Come the Co-Eds several years later. They do a bit in this film that I call this the lost routine, because I have never seen this in another one of their movies. I don't think they've ever done it on the radio show, to my knowledge, at least none of the ones I've heard or can remember. But they do this bit where Bud fires Lou, and Lou says, "Okay, well, give me my money, and then I'll leave. You owe me. I worked for you for a year. I get $1 a day." The 40s. So you owe me $365. So the whole bit is Bud basically finding a way to deduct money from Lou. Saying things like, "Well, you only worked 18 hours a day. That's only half a day, so I shouldn't pay you for the whole day. So that's, however much off. And, you didn't work Sundays. There's 52 Sundays in a year, so you're not going to get, I shouldn't pay you for those 52, and it goes on and on and on and on, basically, until Lou only ends up getting $1. It is a really funny routine. And again, it's one that I don't think they ever redid in any of their movies. It's not one that I recall from any of the radio shows. And that's weird to me, because it's a really funny routine. But it's kind of the only reason to watch this movie. And even then, just watch this routine. They also do their famous mustard routine in here, where they're eating a hot dog and Bud's trying to give Lou mustard, and Lou's saying, "I don't want mustard," and Bud's like, "We gotta have mustard. Mustard goes with the hot dog," and Lou's like, "It doesn't go on mine." And it's just this whole thing about, why he doesn't like mustard, and if you don't eat mustard, all the hot dogs factories are gonna close the mustard factories down. It's extremist, and it's hilarious, and I love it. And that routine is really well done. So those two routines are kind of the only saving grace of this movie. Apparently, from what I understand, audiences at the time felt the exact same way. This movie was panned critically when it came out. Like, audiences hated it. They couldn't figure out what was going on, what the story was about, why you kept cutting away to Abbott and Costello, and why were Abbott and Costello the best parts of the movie, which they were. They had way more chemistry than our main leads. Their bits were funnier. And when they weren't on screen, the movie was just painful. There are two good parts of this movie that don't involve Abbott and Costello. And one of them is like just kind of a little accidental thing. It's like at the very beginning, when the two guys are going to see Nancy Kelly as our main love interest. Nancy Kelly is up in her suite, and she's in her wedding dress, and she hears the door knock, and she gets up and she runs to the door and like slides across the floor in her wedding dress. Kind of like a little kid will when they're wearing socks on a kitchen floor. And it's just such a tiny little thing. I don't know why it was funny. And it wasn't like laugh out loud funny. It was more just, oh, that's kind of cute funny. That was a cute little character moment kind of thing. But that was really good. The final musical number is pretty impressive. It's a big dance number with hundreds and hundreds of people doing this big old dance. And it's pretty freaking spectacular. Especially when you consider that, this is well before you could CGI cheat and just digitally put in, hundreds of dancing extras. No, they actually had to get 100-some people to dance this big number at the end of this film. So for that alone, it's pretty damn impressive. The song itself is totally forgettable. You can't really understand what they're saying because there's so many people singing and dancing. So you don't know what the song is. And the other songs in this are terrible. Oh my God. They're so bad. Oh, they are just awful songs. Jerome Kern, shame on you. It says that this is the first movie to feature music of his where one of the songs didn't become a hit. And I can't say I'm surprised. They're terrible. And what makes them even worse, and we'll see this as we go into the Abbott and Costello filmography, is that writing songs for men back then, male singers that they had in some of these movies, they didn't have like these smooth Frank Sinatra crooner type voices. All these guys were like basically almost opera singers. So they're singing these love songs in this very kind of I do love you, I do love you. And it just sounds terrible. Oh my God. And again, we're going to see a lot of that in these old movies as we look at them. But man alive, the songs in this are terrible. And Jerome Kern was not happy with this movie. And he wasn't happy with Abbott and Costello's inclusion in it. He was mad. They said, one of the reviewers said, I don't think Jerome Kern knows who Abbott and Costello are. Because he seems almost surprised every time they pop up on screen. So this movie is just for completionists. If this movie did not have Abbott and Costello in it, and if this movie wasn't their first movie, then this film would be lost to history. It would be just another footnote showing, in a mixture of stuff on TCM. If that, I don't think this movie's ever even been on TCM as far as I know. And if it ever was, it was simply because it's the first movie with Abbott and Costello. If it hadn't been for them, this film would literally be nothing. It almost is nothing with them in it. So this movie bombed. This movie bombed pretty bad, but it served its purpose. Audiences hated the movie, but they loved Abbott and Costello. And what it proved was that this vaudeville radio team could be box office draws. And so the next film would have Bud and Lou as the main stars. So when next we return with Drive Home Reviews meets Abbott and Costello, we're going to take a look at Bud and Lou's first solo picture. Say solo, even though there's two of them. Just to give you an idea of how bad Night in the Tropics really is, Abbott and Costello didn't even acknowledge it as one of their films. They acknowledged Buck Privates as their first movie and basically wanted to forget this one. Again, this is a film for completionists. This is a film for people like me who wanted to own every Abbott and Costello movie and now want to review every Abbott and Costello movie. Something that I am both going to enjoy and regret doing. But I love watching Bud and Lou, and I love talking about Bud and Lou. So when next we meet, we will take a look at Bud and Lou's official first movie. The first movie in the Abbott and Costello film canon, and the film that is going to cement them as one of the most important pop culture acts in history. We will take a look at Buck Privates. So thank you for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.